Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Lyle Goldstein. I'm director of the China Initiative here, and thrilled to welcome you to a new semester of China Chat. This is a effort to build on Ed Steinfeld's great work in building up our China effort here at Watson, and kind of carrying that forward by sort of building a closer knit round community to come together to talk about really all issues affecting China and how China affects us. Of course, I have my own kind of particular interests, as you'll learn more today. But I want to say that we have very diverse interests in China that certainly encompasses a variety of other key realms, cultural and economic, for sure. Next week, we're very pleased to welcome Xiangli Ding from Rhode Island School of Design. And he will talk about China's huge effort in hydroelectric energy, dam building. So this is immensely consequential for our whole world, and really he's just come out with a new book on the issue. So very excited to see him. So that's in this room next week, 12th February. So please be here for that. And the week after that, we'll have our own Saul Wilson, who's a postgrad here, who will talk on the issue of China's political economy. And that's a particular forte of our group here at Watson. So please, you don't want to miss these talks. By the way, I will say I still have an opening actually on 5 March. So if anybody here in this room has some research they want to put forward, don't be shy. We'll welcome you here. And when I say building community, part of that is drawing from all parts of our community, including graduate students, although we've also been privileged to be able to showcase a lot of Brown's own faculty and invite scholars from around, let's say, around the neighborhood, like RISD, like Naval War College, like, up the street at Harvard or what have you. Okay, well, one other thing I do want to say before I launch into this talk. It's a talk I gave at Harvard early in December, and then I gave at Beida, Peking University, in December as well. So I'm pleased to share it with my friends at Brown. It's really the identical content. I will say, by the way, this talk is being recorded, so keep that in mind. And when you ask questions, let's make sure to get you one of these mics so that the people listening, because we're live streaming as well, so they don't miss it, okay? But I did want to say that in keeping with our tradition at China Chat, we try to make a little bit of time at the end to just talk about whatever's on our mind, okay? This really is a chat and quite informal, as I said. People come and go. People get seconds, so please feel free to kind of wander around. It's fine. But you may want to discuss tariffs. You may want to discuss DeepSeek. Maybe you want to talk about fentanyl. These issues are on all our mind. It's such a wide range of issues we think about every day in U.S.-China relations and with China in general. So please, we will talk about this rather dark subject, but I will reserve the last 10 minutes to invite you to raise other issues on your mind and ask not just me these questions about fentanyl and so forth. I'm no expert on fentanyl, but well, my wife is. But please, let's listen to each other. Have a real dialogue. By the way, there's still some seats here for people who are looking. Right. One final piece of introductory remarks are that I have just come back from a major research trip through Asia. I was in China, of course. Got up to the northeast, Dongbei, went to Harbin, Changchun, and I was in Beijing, of course, and also visited Kazakhstan, Philippines, and South Korea on this ambitious trip. So if people want to talk about the trip too, I'm happy to share with you. And anybody who has a particular interest, I do have a trip report, which I'm willing to share. Okay, so let's talk about this most serious and grave issue. I must say, I've been asked a lot about tariffs in the last 48 hours, and I keep trying to tell people we got to, let's say, remember what's really important, and that I don't mean to. I'm not trying to demean that issue at all. That does affect people's livelihoods, of course, but this is an issue that truly impacts all of us, and we ought to keep it front and center. And I've always maintained, and I'll come to this in the end, that that I would like President Trump and President Xi to talk a lot about this, and to make it a focal point of a variety of bilateral summits, which I think are in order. I'll come to that in the end. I've been working on nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy for a long time. Did my dissertation on that issue, so I continue to follow it closely. We have some new and disturbing news on this front. Just a couple of weeks ago, at the end of January, this article came out in the Financial Times. I'm sure many of you have seen it, discussing a new military headquarters being built in Beijing that is said to be something like 10 times the size of the Pentagon, which is pretty ambitious if you've ever spent time in that building. And of course, not surprisingly, maybe this building seems to be built very deeply into the ground, and which certainly suggests it has the ability to withstand at least some kind of nuclear hits. And I must say, having wandered around Beijing and Shanghai quite a bit over the last couple of years, this is not the only place where you're seeing people dig deep and lay a lot of protective construction work. So this is rather disturbing, let's say. We may hope it's just kind of a vast employment project, but I'm not so sure. Here's another piece of rather disturbing news that has popped up in the last few weeks among people who follow the cross-Strait balance, as I do. And this not only does this seem to be real, as far as I can tell, but this article, this initial set of writings on it, may underestimate just how many of these ships are being built. And as I'll discuss, this is a critical part of our thinking, even as we consider the nuclear issue, which unfortunately is coalescing with the Taiwan issue in some very, very dangerous ways. Okay, well, it's not all doom and gloom. I just saw this in the Washington Post. So if you want a little bit of happy news on U.S.-China front, I think I found some cheer in this article by Graham Allison, and maybe we'll bring Graham down to discuss it. It's I think, a very important piece. So have a look at that. Okay, well, I think most of you know me, so I won't dwell on my background at all, really, but I do a lot of work on China. I try to go to China a lot. This was my visit to the Chinese Navy Museum. I follow the conventional balance very, very closely, but I remain interested in the nuclear balance as well. That's me at Tsinghua University last year. I was back there, of course, on my last visit, but you got some of the foremost Chinese nuclear strategists right there sitting, talking with me. So that's try to get there frequently. By the way, on the top right, you see some of my work on Russia-China relations, and my book on Russia-China relations should be out this year, I'm pleased to say, and we'll come and share that with China Chat as well. But as I said, a real focus of mine over the last decade has been to kind of zero in on the conventional balance. And this, I do recommend for those of you who are interested in the cross-Strait conventional balance, this study from CSIS, which I have studied extremely carefully. And as you can see on the right, the our Chinese friends have studied it incredibly closely as well and reported out its major results. We can talk about that, but as it turns out, the conventional balance and the nuclear balance are intimately tied here, and we'll get into that more. So today, I'm going to share. I'm going to go very quickly here because that's kind of our tradition in China Chat. So I'll zip right through. But please, if anybody wants to follow up with me, and I would at some point like to do a kind of extended version of this. But I'll just start by making some comment on the new DoD report. Those are always good sources of information generally. Then I'll spend a bit of time surveying current Chinese perspectives, which I don't think are often seen by Westerners. So I think that's important, right? It takes two to tango in this rivalry, so we need to consider that. But I want to spend the bulk of my time today drawing attention to a variety of studies that have been produced in Washington recently by some think tanks. I find these studies extremely disturbing, and that's kind of why I moved to share this research with you kind of urgently. So I almost call these studies or their authors not too affectionately as a kind of new wizards of Armageddon. By the way, that map shows the September ICBM shot across the Pacific. You may have seen people were taking video from Guam of a Chinese ICBM flying overhead. I think that's a kind of telling symbol of where we're at, although it didn't get much press. I guess it was competing with the U.S. election. So now I made this slide, I think, in November. The report came out in December. So there's a new report. This is the 23 one. But I did review the sort of what's new and different in the 24 report that literally just came out in December. So this is kind of the U.S. government's best estimate at where China's at across the board. And it makes for some pretty eye-opening reading. The highlights are China has over 600 operational warheads. That may not seem like too many, but what's interesting here is the trajectory. That is, the last report, 23, showed 500. Now we're at 600. So we're basically going up 100 a year. That's quite a rapid set of movements. And of course, it was 400, I think, the year before that. And China is projected to have 1,000 operational warheads by 2030. And they were said to have built, and this is really the big story that probably most of you have heard already, that China has built about 320 silos. Okay, and that is how to put it. Those are not cheap, and I believe 320 new silos. I believe that's more than the total silos that Russia wields, for example. So Russia is the biggest nuclear power on Earth. So I think that gives you an idea of the scale of what is going on, out there in China's western deserts, in Xinjiang, Gansu. Okay, so that's a kind of look at what. Let me underline one more point. When you look at this new report, you're going to see the word low yield all over the new report. Now, that's not entirely new, but it should be very disturbing to all of us. And I'll explain that a little more as I get through the end of the talk. But the tendency toward building up low yield weapons shows a new inclination on both sides to entertain the idea of limited nuclear war, which is extremely disturbing. All right, so I'll probably use that word disturbing a lot in this talk. Forgive me. I'm disturbed. Okay, so forgive me, I didn't get the translation for this slide up, but I just came across this as I was finishing up my book, and I thought I'd share it quickly. But what this is a Chinese article looking at Russian tactical nuclear weapons and kind of puzzling over why does Russia have so many tactical nuclear weapons? What is the point? And one of the part of the reasoning, this Chinese analysis, which is a bit dated, I think it's something like 2014. Yeah, 2014, explains that this is to compensate for conventional weakness. So, that's quite an interesting conclusion. It's interesting that the Chinese were studying, Russia's tactical nuclear weapons arsenal, but this corresponds, logically with the notion that China is thinking hard about where it wants to go on this. Although the tone of this particular article, and this was about 10 years ago, is more, this is a problem for the world. So that's interesting. But I think the tone has shifted considerably, in part because of what we've been doing. Now, some of you may recognize the title of this book, 2034, Admiral Stavridis. Actually, I think he's speaking at Harvard this February, so you can ask him yourself what his thinking is on this. But if you read his book, and I hate to steal his thunder here, but he projects a war between the U.S. and China that ends with a nuclear exchange. I won't tell you what American cities are become craters. It's very uncomfortable reading, and I must say, although I don't, I'm not in love with this book, but I think he's exactly right that is the way the war could end, plausibly. Now, this book didn't go unnoticed, as you can see, and China, was, I think, quite rightly disturbed by this book. Okay, they read it carefully. Not surprising. So, what have the Chinese been saying lately? And here you have a professor. I think he's at Fudan. I haven't met Professor Zhang, but he says, "Hey, so those Americans, they talk a good game, but when you really look at it, what those Americans do is they talk a lot about arms control, but actually they act like they're getting ready to fight a nuclear war." So he said, you've got to keep that in mind. So I thought that was a pretty interesting observation. But actually, this one I consider even more important. And I haven't met Professor Hu. Unfortunately, I think he's at Tsinghua. Why do I say this article is particularly important? Because this phrase, 美国战略机会主义, I've seen in a lot of Chinese nuclear strategy assessments. I think those characters are kind of the new kind of buzzword for suggesting why exactly China has to build up its nuclear forces so massively. And sorry, I didn't translate those characters, but what they're talking about there is U.S. strategic, so-called U.S. strategic opportunism. So a sense that the U.S. could lever its nuclear advantage to gain strategic dividends. So this is the tone, and I think this is, to me, that phrasing kind of explains pretty well what we're seeing China engage in here. I did get to meet these authors on a visit to Beijing, and I asked them point blank. I said, let me get this straight. You're telling me that you are really thinking about limited nuclear war now? And I was shocked at the answer. I expected him to say, no, it's not, we're not really engaged in that. But actually they said, yes, we are studying this very carefully now. And I said, well, why are you doing that? and they said, and of course, not funny at all. They said, we're doing that because you're doing that. Pretty straightforward. And I must say, quite accurate. So I've done quite a bit of work on how Chinese strategists interpret the Ukraine war, including on the nuclear side. So I refer you to this article that I wrote about I've also not met Professor Zhao. He's at Fudan. He's a very well-known Russia expert. But there's China, I think, is of two minds on this. They're quite disturbed by what Russia's been doing, no question about it. But on the other hand, they realize the nuclear weapons are trumps in many respects. Okay, it's my timer telling me to get moving. Here's no claim that this is some kind of major authoritative article or anything, but I must say that this is the first time I've ever seen Chinese nuclear strategists say that it's important for a country to have a surprise nuclear strike or first strike capability, that gives more leverage. So that, this is, I think, an outlier. I haven't seen that elsewhere, but I just, to me, it kind of shows this sounds awfully 1980s, doesn't it? And is that where we're going with China into the 1980s? I sure hope not. That was a scary time. I grew up then. A lot of talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I guess that's good. That was exceedingly dangerous. I think some people here lived through that. I did not, but I'm not quite that old. But here's just another example, though, of how influential I think this idea of strategic opportunism here. This was a 2023 analysis. Very, very interesting piece. Also mentions the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's some discussion of this new U.S. deployment of medium-range missiles to Philippines, which, as you can imagine, they're rather anxious about. Okay, well, let me turn around now and talk about kind of, you get a glimpse of the Chinese discussion. Let's talk about what Americans are saying, especially those folks in D.C. And I commend all of these studies. A lot of ink being spilled on this, which I think is generally good. I know some of the people who are involved in this kind of second peer study. That's kind of a new buzzword in Washington, that we're in this new environment. We not only confront Russia, but also China, and we need the nuclear forces to match, i.e. like we need to sort of, something the logic is clearly hinting at, that the United States would need to double its nuclear forces or something like that. I don't buy that, obviously, but the argument is being made. Anyway, okay, the studies that I want to focus on, there are two from Atlantic Council that came out in 2023. This is one of them by Professor Kronig from Georgetown. Maybe he's listening on the live stream. I'm not a fan of this study. It's very short, so you can digest this in one sitting, really. But you will have trouble sleeping afterward, I think. Anyway, I hate to do this because it's a bit crude, but I think I'll just read this, if you don't mind. While the United States is investing in conventional capabilities to deter and, if necessary, defeat a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, a window could open in which China possesses capabilities for an invasion, but the United States has not yet acquired the capabilities to deny the attack. In this instance, the United States might choose to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese invasion force. So, that's pretty clear logic. You see the link between the conventional balance and the nuclear balance. I have never, in my time, my 3 decades as an expert following China, U.S. strategic interaction, I've never seen a U.S. Analyst suggest this. So I think we're dealing with something new here. But as you can see, this is quickly gaining momentum in Washington. Okay, this analysis by Professor Kronig. Sorry, I don't mean to read to you, but I think these words are really worth thinking more. The U.S. should shape its Indo-Pacific force posture to reduce the risk of Chinese nuclear use, including by developing robust conventional forces and hardening and dispersing forces to make a nuclear strike minimally advantageous for China. U.S. policymakers should also consider formally extending the U.S. nuclear umbrella over Taiwan. The United States should consider which new forces would be helpful: theater-based low-yield weapons capable of striking moving maritime targets. You see that term low yield. Because such a war could escalate, the United States should consider further investments in homeland missile defense. So better get going on those defenses. Again, totally new approach from what I can tell. I've never seen U.S. experts advocating for extending the U.S. Nuclear umbrella over Taiwan. So I haven't seen that. By the way, we used to have U.S. nuclear weapons based in Taiwan. Yeah, well, maybe that's where we're going back to. But that was the 1950s and 60s. But fortunately, all those came out in the 70s as part of our rapprochement. Okay, one more from Professor Kronig. The U.S. should develop and deploy non-strategic nuclear weapons to Asia that are able to carry out a nuclear attack against moving naval targets. The U.S. should initiate a dialogue with Taipei, that's Taiwan, about the risks of nuclear escalation in the event of a Chinese invasion and planning for U.S. nuclear use on Taiwanese territory at the request of the Taiwanese government. The U.S. should provide the Taiwanese military the training and equipment to provide the conventional support to U.S. nuclear operations and to operate in the environment likely to prevail after nuclear detonation. So, welcome to the new world, folks. We're getting ready to fight a nuclear war. And not only are we going to fight a nuclear war, our friends are going to ask them to nuke them. This is pretty surreal. Anyway, by the way, the Atlantic Council is not some kind of obscure think tank. It's one of the leading think tanks in Washington, D.C. And there's some further evidence. This fellow Kronig has the ear of our national security advisor. I think they co-authored a piece even. So these people are not far from power at all. In fact, this guy, Greg Weaver, I don't know him or Kronig, but Weaver was the head of nuclear strategy planning in the Joint Chiefs until he retired recently. So that literally is one step away. If we're about to fight a nuclear war, who would the president call? Probably that person, right? The lead nuclear planner for the Joint Staff. So, I would say this guy is 2 steps from the button. And here's what he has to say. This is also published by the Atlantic Council, by the way. Limited nuclear first use to coerce war termination on China's terms. This role for Chinese nuclear forces essentially mirrors an element of Russian strategy. So, so they're learning from the Russians, apparently. I partly agree. Initiate limited nuclear use to avoid defeat by coercing the adversary to terminate the conflict on one's own terms, or at least on terms that one can accept. China's growing arsenal of militarily effective theater nuclear capabilities backed by a highly survivable strategic nuclear deterrent enables this role. There is one potential circumstance in which this would most likely be considered by China's leadership. If it faces the impending defeat of the PRC conventional invasion, this course of action would be made more credible and thus more likely if China's leadership believes there is a marked asymmetry of stakes favoring China. So a lot to unpack there, but in a word, here's a slightly different theory, right? If Kronig was saying, well, maybe we have to use them, here Weaver is saying, well, hold on, China most likely to use them because they're losing the war. Maybe, I think that's plausible, though China does have a no first use policy. But I guess what Weaver's saying is don't buy that. Words are cheap. True. I agree with that. Okay, here's another point by Weaver. He says, this is more disturbing, I think. He says, the U.S. and allied stake in the outcome of a Taiwan conflict is high enough for them to risk nuclear escalation and high enough to persevere through limited nuclear exchanges. So think about that for a minute, folks. He's basically saying the stakes are high enough that we need to fight this war and fight. If it comes to limited nuclear war, so be it. Get ready for that. The United States in particular needs to clearly communicate that it views China's seizure of Taiwan by force is fundamentally transforming the strategic situation in East Asia, and that Chinese use of nuclear weapons would further raise the U.S. stake in the outcome. Taiwan is not Ukraine. Well, that's an interesting statement. The U.S. national interest in its defense is far greater. Well, I'm pretty familiar with the Ukraine situation, and I disagree with that. Anyway, but some of you may agree with that. I don't know. I think some people in this current administration may hold that view. Okay, last point from Weaver here. Destroy the Chinese amphibious invasion force offshore. China has a unique vulnerability to U.S. nuclear attack. In a Taiwan invasion scenario, the landing operations themselves. The landing force has an inescapable problem. It must concentrate to land sufficient force to overcome the Taiwanese defenders. If it does not, it will be defeated on the beach. But against a nuclear-armed adversary, concentrating large-scale amphibious landing force offshore for many hours presents perhaps the best possible conventional force target for nuclear attack. Yeah. So basically, we have a very juicy target, folks. How could we pass this up? That's pretty... that's pretty scary, because what you have here is an experienced nuclear planner saying this is our silver bullet here, our ace in the hole. Of course, the piece, strangely does not work through the next step. Let's say we did do that. How does China respond? Did they take out Hawaii, Anchorage, Seattle, Guam? You pick the target. Surely China would respond, but that's not really dealt with. All right, one more piece of Washington wisdom I'd like to share with you, or not the opposite of wisdom, really. Okay, so this is from CNAS, another leading think tank, probably the number 2 think tank, maybe after Atlantic Council. So again, these are not kind of outlier views. Highly influential in the Biden administration, that's for sure. So was Atlantic Council. But okay, so what do they say? TTX tabletop exercise demonstrates that senior U.S. decision makers are unlikely to be uniform in their assessment that a nuclear fight over Taiwan merits a U.S. nuclear response. How strange, people might disagree on that. I would think so. Even after red nuclear escalation, multiple blue players voiced their view that U.S. interests in Taiwan were not worth the risk of an in-kind response. Well, that sounds reasonable. Meanwhile, red players consistently priced in blue responses into their actions and showed a greater tolerance for operational risk, given a set of strategic conditions. These differences indicate that PRC nuclear escalation would likely create a significant political decision-making challenges for the United States. So yeah, I think that's a little bit more accurate than Mr. Weaver's assessment. So good on CNAS, but it gets worse. Because clearly they share some of the ideas from the Atlantic Council that were put forth. So today in the Pacific, naval vessels at sea and military air bases on small islands are a vastly different target set in both quantity and kind. The combination of precision, low-yield weapons and target discrimination means that a belligerent could use a few weapons with confidence that they will hit their targets with relatively little collateral damage. No worries, folks. This calculation decreases the overall fears of escalation. No worries. And increases the potential for use. So, you can see why I'm a little stirred up about this. And one final thought from CNAS here. These authors, U.S. leaders may need to create substantial escalatory pressures to manage the conflict. So we got to escalate, folks. That's the only way out of this. Given the asymmetry of targets, that's an interesting one to think about, the asymmetry of targets. The United States likely lacks the necessary theater nuclear capabilities to engage in effective conflict management to forestall successful nuclear coercion. Okay. So we'd better build up fast and figure out this target issue. All right, let me. This is my last slide here, I think, and I'll just say, to summarize, I think we're in a very dark place right now. Although I too would rather talk about tariffs, but we better talk about this. And I think, driving this, there's no question in my mind that this is primarily driven by the Taiwan issue. So if the Taiwan issue did not exist, I think we probably would not be having these conversations. I'm almost sure of that. But there are other factors, there are other places where we have tensions, South China Sea and whatnot. I think there's a shadow of the Ukraine war, no question. China's buildup, obviously. AI is part of this. Hypersonics are part of this. And by the way, China seems to have many deployed hypersonic missiles, many types, let's say, and we don't have any. We're working on it. But let me emphasize this last point here, which I think is really, really disturbing. That is, even in the happy scenario where war is avoided, and I do think that there are ample off ramps, as I'll go to in a minute. But to me, we face the prospect of spending a huge amount of money on this. I mean, did you see every single part of those arguments were premised on the fact that we're going to massively build up both our conventional and our nuclear forces. All right. So the opportunity costs. Brown has a tradition of looking at the costs of war. These costs are immense. And, if some of us think there are other things we maybe should be spending these funds on. Okay, what are my recommendations very quickly? And then I'll open for questions, maybe 10 minutes of questions and then 10 minutes of China chat, about sanctions and whatever is on your mind. But, okay, well, you heard I definitely am advocating for G2, call it G2. G2, people don't like that term, but a U.S.-China summit, annual summit is very badly needed. It should not be 3 hours. It should be 3 days. And one of those days should be focused on these issues we're talking about here. I think we also need a P5 annual summit. I've just published a piece on that. I can send that to you too. But the idea that Russia, China, the U.S., France, and Britain their leaders would get together, maybe even twice a year to talk through these issues, I think is also critically needed and would probably be a good way to start to end the Ukraine war finally. Okay, how do we dial down Taiwan tensions? This is so important. Like I said, in a way, that is the Gordian knot that is driving this whole problem. I think we need some kind of resumption of cross-Strait negotiations. I think the United States should advocate and even push for that. I think we need Washington to return to a genuine, substantive one China policy, which we've gotten far away from, unfortunately. I think we can think about curtailing some of these surge deployments that have been going on. I mean, if you've been watching the Philippines, as I have, or the Ryukyus, for example, what's going on there? I mean, every exercise is larger than the last exercise. Okay, so yes, that's unnerving the Chinese, but it's also, so there is some deterrence aspect, but it works the other way too, folks. And China may see incentives to go sooner rather than later. That's one of my big concerns these days. And China, of course, we want China to also reciprocate with restraint in its exercises, which have been large and also destabilizing. So one way we can work on this is to think seriously about no first use. I really think that this would help alleviate a lot of the stresses that we can see here. I think sort of taking nuclear weapons off the table would lower the temperature massively and probably do quite a bit to prevent that temptation toward escalation, which I fear is probably more on our side, actually. That temptation toward first use. I could go through, more arms control measures. You may wonder what about this diagram here. This is a diagram of a Russian system from a Chinese naval journal. And, Russia seems to be working hard on this system. It's like a unmanned vehicle that carries a thermonuclear weapon. It's powered by nuclear power, so it can travel thousands of miles and go at high speed. It's, sort of an apocalyptic weapon. I think it's real. And, it seems like North Korea is actually playing around with this similar kind of toy. And, look, civilized countries, if you will, China and the United States should get together and say, this kind of thing is out of bounds. We don't need to go there. And so that's an area we could work on with China. But, there are other areas we need to work with China on. So let me stop there. And how about some questions? Okay, Jim. Professor Head. Oh, hold on. Jim, let's get you. Make sure the people, your viewers can hear you.
So, Lyle, all of this is very logical and scary, as you say, but my main concern about this whole thing is the fact that we're being led by an impetuous decision-making president who will doesn't listen to advice and is also doesn't have a good sense of cause and effect. How does that play into this whole scene?
Right. You bring me back to 2017 when President Trump was talking about fire and fury, and I was also incredibly disturbed by that, and I think I'm sure everybody in this room was. That fire and fury discussion made me take 2 trips down to the China-North Korean border and other places, trying to do whatever I could to figure out how the heck to diffuse this. Now, I mean, as you remember from that circumstance, we ended up, a few months later, finding President Trump making more than one visit with Kim Jong-un. So, I mean, it was a very strange evolution. As I studied that evolution, I became convinced that actually it wasn't Trump who kind of unhinged that whole thing, although, I guess one could argue it was wrongheaded to begin with, but actually his advisors, Bolton and Pompeo, who both seemed to go all out more or less to torpedo that effort. But I guess it's a long way of saying, like, yes, I'm disturbed. I think the Congress was briefly considering some kind of measures to establish like congressional control over nuclear use, which I would welcome. I mean, I think we the tendency in the use of force in general, but also in even in nuclear use, has been toward nuclear command and control, has been toward making sure that the president can hit the button whenever he wants. But I mean, I think as your question strongly hints, that should make us all rather uncomfortable. And so I would like to see a much more cautious approach. I believe no first use would really rein in a lot of these voices and establish a clear line of thinking, maybe from the Congress, saying, we don't need this. We do not. We have a very strong armed forces. As long as we take a kind of cautious approach in the world and exercise, restraint, we do not need to resort to first use. Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, let's get you a microphone. Hold on, Will.
Excuse me if I don't get up. Yes. Yes. Is this on? Can people hear me? It's okay, there we go. Lyle, I'd like to just mention a very compelling analogy to all of this, where we see Taiwan as the ham in the sandwich between the U.S. and China. And I've lived through a situation similar, being Canadian, in the late 50s, where, when the U.S. and Russia were rattling these rockets against each other. And of course, if there was a conflict between the U.S. and Russia, the fallout ends up in Canada, because that's right in the middle, it's the ham and the sandwich. Mm-hmm. And I bring to your attention the analogy. In 1958, John Diefenbaker, who was Premier of Canada, decided to fold down the Air Force, which was the strongest at the time post-war in that part of the world, and said, okay, we'll accept the United States nuclear umbrella to protect Canada. And this was against the wishes of Canadians. We didn't want nuclear weapons on our soil, right, because we felt that would make us a prime target. And we didn't want it from 58 all the way through to 1972. But because Diefenbaker had agreed to this, the United States put in a system called the Beaumark missile system. I don't know if you're familiar with that or recall it. And the Beaumark missile system was all across the north of Canada. It replaced the DEW line, DEW.
Could I ask you to come to the point?
The point is,
I get where you're going, though.
There was no nuclear weapons in those missiles. There was no nuclear allowed on Canada's soil for 20 years. Mm. And it did serve as a deterrent, a huge deterrent against being the target. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Mm. Perhaps interesting analogy to your idea.
No, it is a very interesting analogy. And for my part, I kind of abhor these new tensions in U.S.-Canadian relations. I think that's ridiculous, of course. But and Canada is a very strong ally of the United States, no question about it. But I mean, well, let me be very blunt. If I'll put on my Chinese hat for a minute and just say, Russia was never claiming Canada, and therefore it's a very different situation. And Canada is a huge country, moreover, and Taiwan is not. So to me, this really is a true a powder keg in every sense of the word. And my sense, when I reported, I'll tell you one of the reactions I got in China when I presented this information was, oh, clearly you Americans have some crazy ideas. That was the first reaction. Well, I guess I agree on that. But then he said that maybe we need to go immediately to 1,500 weapons, So, that seems to be the approach, the idea that we're somehow going to coerce China into changing its view on Taiwan, I think is, how to put it, that seems to me as a pipe dream. Yes, sir. Let's start here. Sorry, right down here, and then we'll go to the back next. If you could keep your questions kind of short, that might be good to get around a lot of questions.
Yes, thank you. I'm actually thinking about sort of more immediate domestic implications. For example, Asian Americans. I mean, what do you think this? Because it seems to be right now restricted around the small circles and the think tanks. Do you think it's gonna? Do you think it's have an effect on sort of?
Yeah, maybe you could repeat for the mic. It's on. It's on.
Okay,
yeah.
So I'm just asking a question about the implications on domestic politics for Asian Americans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will tell you, and I really welcome this question because I think it's not like as this rivalry spools up and potentially becomes much more intense, and the risks being so immense. I do fear that this could have. Well, we've already seen a glimpse of this, I think, during the pandemic and things like that, where when U.S.-China tensions became so acute that this, the Asian American community became victims in a kind of horrible way. And that really bothers me. In fact, I want to tell you, we're holding a conference that will take that partly as a focus on May 8 and 9 of this year. And we'll present a paper exactly on that issue. But yeah, I mean, to me, as the rivalry intensifies, that will create all kinds of acute pressures in the domestic politics of both countries, not just the United States, but also China. I mean, they have their hawks and we have ours, and dissident voices are, tend to get smashed, one way or another. So, or people who are kind of associated with the other. So it's very troubling, and I thank you for the question. In the back.
Is this on? Okay. So I saw that you are an advocate for a no first use policy from the United States, and I suspect that would probably not be well received, or folks would not necessarily. They'd make the argument that would limit us strategically, something like that. Whether or not that is a good thing or a bad thing, I assume that would be the counter argument to that. I don't know. Is there a declaration of mutual vulnerability between China and the United States? And if not, would that be a more realistic declaration to make to kind of preserve that condition of MAD?
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question and clarification. The truth is that there has been I believe the Obama administration and then subsequently the Biden administration did think this over quite a bit, which is encouraging. I don't sort of know any kind of the inner, I'm not privy to those discussions, but there are a lot of reports that was exactly the direction that the conversation went in. It said, well, the no first use it's just not possible. And by the way, I'm quite concerned that our friends in Japan and in Germany really went to the mat to kill this idea, which I find that very disturbing. But anyway, we could chat about that in another way, in another form. But your suggestion that, okay, well, at least we could make a statement of mutual vulnerability. And in a way, in January 2022, there was a statement of, that by the P5 leaders saying that that the nuclear war can never be fought. So that was a little bit in that direction, but I think we have to go much further. Is the truth? I mean, of course, there will be a little bit of loss of kind of as it were deterrent factor here. But again, I view our conventional forces as immensely strong as they should be, and we do not need that. There's no conceivable scenario here that is in our strategic interest that would merit the use of nuclear weapons, and I include in that a Taiwan scenario. But just to take Japan for a minute, and I'm sorry to pick on my friends in Tokyo, but they, can't. What kind of threat from China are they envisioning against Japan that would merit the sacrifice of American cities? Do you know about the Diaoyu Senkaku dispute? This island with goats on it? No, I'm not going to fight a nuclear war over an island with goats. It's really not an island. It's more like a rock. So, there are some fairly, ridiculous issues out there that are kind of masquerading as U.S. strategic interests. And I'd like to see that stop and us get to a much more realistic, safer, more stable place that prevents this terrible nuclear arms race, which will bankrupt us and put us on the brink for the next, several decades. Caleb. Yeah. Could we get the microphone down here?
Testing. How do you?
Hold on one second, Caleb. Let me just say also, the floor is now open for any and all questions. If you want to ask each other about again, we're very informal here. If you want to talk about sanctions or fentanyl, tariffs or DeepSeek, let's do that too. But go ahead.
Speaking on the escalation angle, do you have any opinion or view on recently Seth announced a plan for a nationwide Iron Dome equivalent, such as what Israel has with historical treaties like the ABM Treaty against national missile shields? Do you see that as an escalatory measure, as it suddenly will kind of shift the MAD proposition in our favor potentially?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Caleb. And by the way, I do see some faces that aren't usually here at China Chat, and just email me and I'll put you right on the list so you can get all the information on China Chats coming up. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I did see that statement, and I'm quite disturbed by what Secretary Hegseth has said about that. I think we have to realize, looking back over the last 20 or 30 years, that the decision to leave the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which had been agreed in 1972, but that decision, well, like all of this in a way is the fruit of that misguided decision. And arguably a lot of the tensions we've had with Russia are also the result of that. So I think that was foolish. I think the effort at building ballistic missile defenses, while it has yielded, technological gains, and we've seen some of those with Iron Dome, although I think Iron Dome, the set of even the kind of physics principles are quite different. Talking about a small area versus like a massive area, and Iron Dome is, as you know, is mostly focused on primitive short-range weapons. So it's not, so I just in general, the idea I think is misapplied, but a lot of what I see in China's buildup and in Russia's buildup for that matter, and in the way that China watches Russia's buildup, and I have the evidence to prove that, they have been laser focused on how do they penetrate those shields to preserve what they view as nuclear deterrence. So it was destabilizing in the 1960s and 70s when they came up with it, and it's still destabilizing. And we should be very cautious about moving in that direction. By the way, I'll just throw in there, and I'm out on a limb a little here, but there's been a lot of talk about Greenland lately. And I guess you can see Greenland here in this map. But the trajectory, if China is shooting from Gansu province or Xinjiang, if they're firing at Boston or Providence, probably Greenland would be a nice place to put all your apparatus. But, and I dare say I wonder if there's a link between the Greenland idea and the America Iron Dome idea. It's, again, this is a way to unhinge, U.S.-China strategic stability, and could be very costly and destabilizing. And I don't have high hopes that this would be successful. So thank you for raising the point. Again, the floor is open for any kind of questions. They don't have to be about nuclear strategy, which is a pretty esoteric and disturbing subject. So let's go here to that side. And we'll close on time at 1, which is in 5 minutes. So if you can make your question quick, but I'll stick around, folks.
Thank you so much. I know you said you were sick of talking about tariffs, but I would love to hear your thoughts on like how long you think any tariff would last, because people are going to start to get priced out of things and complain, and it seems really unsustainable. Yeah, no, I take the point. I'm not sick of talking about tariffs. It's very important. I have no doubt that one of the major reasons why the election went the way it went is because of increasing prices. And so, I don't think you have to be a PhD economist to realize that tariff here and tariff there, will eventually set off another round of major inflation, which would seem to be self-defeating. So I guess my going-in thought is that this will quickly, this tendency will quickly go away, because I think the current administration is rational enough to realize that they would be completely shooting themselves in the foot. But tariffs on China have been popular for a long time. So, and maybe the markets have already priced it in and so forth. So I don't know. I'd be curious what other people are thinking about the tariff war. I mean, it is also interesting, as Graham Allison noted in that piece I flashed on the screen, that it's very interesting that Canada and Mexico got treated worse than China, which is may say something good for U.S.-China relations. So we have to look for good news where we can find it. But Professor Rode in front row, did you want to comment?
Hi, Grant Rode from Boston University. About half a dozen years ago, you wrote "Meeting China Halfway," and so I see and I hear the same patterns from that book. In other words, the focus on cycles of de-escalation rather than cycles of escalation. So, my question is: are you a voice in the wilderness? Do people in China talk to you and actually take seriously your approach to people in D.C.? How do you estimate your place in the conversation?
Well, thanks. We're trying. I think one reason I wanted to make this lecture public is mine is kind of a clarion call, if you will, a voice in the wilderness saying, hey, folks, this is really dangerous. We've got to shut this down by taking some definite measures toward stabilizing U.S.-China relations. I'd much rather argue about tariffs and about DeepSeek and its implications than talk about this kind of thing. Look, I'm a little bit encouraged by some of what I've seen, though. So some of the senior people in this administration, it seems to me, understand how important U.S.-China relations are and want to lower tensions. To name the most obvious, and I believe there was a big article. Was it in the Times or in the Post? Big headline, Elon Musk is a huge risk to national security. Never mind that he definitely played a role in saving Ukraine. But I would say that from what I can tell of Musk and his approach toward China, there's a lot of encouraging signs that he, understands that we need to have a pragmatic relationship with China and that we can't make China an enemy. So I'm just saying, I'm not altogether pessimistic. Check out this piece today by Graham Allison in the Washington Post. There's also more kind of a more encouraging
vision that we are not on the brink of the apocalypse. So anyway, thank you so much for coming today. Don't miss next week. It'll be an incredible discussion of the environmental situation in China as it relates to the hydroelectric development, the dams that we see everywhere in China and around the world, frankly. But thanks again for coming this afternoon. And please come back to China Chat. We'll love to see you. Thank you.